Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the latest edition of FreeThought Hour, the show where we have a guest to talk about interesting things with. And I also have my co-host, Tercia. How the devil are you?
I'm Angelica as always, cool, calm, and collected, and I have power, so everything is good in
Yes,
beautiful
yes.
South Africa.
You've got out of your load shedding. And I'm going to say how pretty you look, because I know that you've empowered me, you've permitted me to use that word, which is quite a thin ice
I'm
sort of word in today's woke culture.
I'm a woman. I'm a woman of the 80s. I'm perfectly fine with being pretty. I like
Good,
pretty.
good, good, indeed. Because you say that to some more recent women, and they get on their high horse, thinking that I'm reducing them to a mere sex object, and I'm not. I'm just being
I think we need
complimentary.
to, before we introduce our guest, we need to get our ethos. We need to get an aestheticist so that we can talk about aesthetics um, as a branch of philosophy because aesthetics is a thing, and I don't think wokeness should destroy aesthetics. I like
Yeah,
aesthetics.
good idea. Well, you can search for one such guest, and we'll have them on in the future. But our main guest today, our super guest, the one whose wit and wisdom we really like, is Scott Weigold. How the devil are you, Scott?
Well, I'm good. And I also give you permission to use that word regarding me.
You are you look very pretty, Scott. You look all very pretty indeed.
Thank you.
So John and Scott, as men, um, do I do I turn you in? Do I touch your feminine side when I call you pretty? Should I call you handsome? And would that reduce you to mere sex objects if I refer to you as handsome?
I would simply know you're lying.
No. I accept the description.
My partner and I had a conversation this week about what we find attractive in people in general, but I suppose as cis women in men, and both of us agreed that we find a sharp mind and a good intellectual conversation very uh, I don't. This is a family show, but both of us find that very attractive in a man. So, and Scott, I know that you can give us good intellectual food for thought, and that is the topic. Well, we want to talk about science. You said, John.
Well,
It's
this is a
science.
free this is an unplanned free form chat. So we could delve into whatever you like. And it is interesting because of course culture has changed. And whereas once upon a time a clever woman was thought by the men of the day to be a threat, and not for that not to be an admirable characteristic, we're coming round nowadays to thinking that clever in a woman is really a good feature. In fact, the way the universities are changing, certainly in this country, the the highest scorers in certain facilities are the women. And I've often thought this because having taught for many years, it was easy to see that women, females, are eminently more teachable because they're more content to sit down and do more sedentary things than a boy who's got a lot of energy what he wants to burn off, and he'd be happier playing football or climbing a tree. So my unscientific observation is that the girls are the more teachable, and therefore they should be the sex that is achieving higher grades in examinations and other forms of assessment. What do you think of that?
Scott, on that that topic, do you work with teenagers as a psychiatrist? I know your field of specialty is you work with homeless people, but what John said now reminds me that teenagers and how their brains work or not work is one of my interests, and it is said that on average, of course, when we talk about these things, we always talk on average, that girls' frontal lobes come online younger than boys. Um, so
Right.
do you work with teenagers at all? And maybe you can tell us about teenagers and teenage brains, just and if you can, if it's in your field of expertise.
So I don't work with teenagers directly in the job I have right now. I certainly have over the years. And I'd like to start by saying that you're right. We're talking about averages. And like most things in human populations, we're talking about a bell curve. And the mean of the bell curve may well be different for various different characteristics between boys and girls. But you have to remember that the amount of overlap between the two curves is much, much greater than the difference between the two means. And so while you can statistically separate them, if you walk into a room of boys and girls, you cannot reasonably assume that the girls will all be this way and the boys will all be that way, not by a long shot. So I just want to preface it with that point, that they have much more in common than they do different.
Sure.
In terms of the frontal lobe completing its maturing, it's not like it comes online with a switch, of course, but there is a little bit of difference. But again, that difference is the difference between those two means is relatively small compared to the difference between any two boys or any two girls that are picked at random. And so again, when you're talking about averages, yes, when you're talking about individuals, you should not assume that, because the individual differences can be so large that it can easily fool you into improper assumptions.
Well, that's
How's that for a conversation stopper?
It's all very interesting, but it doesn't answer any questions, does it? Obviously, more research needs to be done in these areas.
Well, I think
John.
Go ahead.
No, sorry. Go ahead, Scott.
I was going to say it does answer some questions, and the questions that it answers is that you cannot take those averages and apply them to random individuals that are in front of you. You need to figure out where these people are that are in front of you, where they are on this spectrum, whether we're talking about frontal lobe maturity or academic performance or athletic performance, all kinds of things. It's much more important to find out who the people are that are in front of you, because presuming that the statistics will be borne out is much more likely to cause you to be wrong.
That leads me to my next question for you. Obviously, psychiatrists, as a psychiatrist, you do more prescription of medication. Well, that's the case in South Africa. Is it the same in
Yes.
the United States? So
Yes.
what is the efficacy of psychiatric medication, and how individualized should it be in terms of dosage? So when you have an individual, you have 10 patients and they all suffer from depression, do you prescribe the same medication to each of them, and you the same and how do you measure the efficacy of that medication?
Excellent questions. And you're going to get some different answers from different psychiatrists. But some people like to start with a medication that's known to be efficacious, that they are extraordinary, that the psychiatrist is extraordinarily familiar with, and then essentially go in a trial and error basis to find what works best for this patient. There's nothing particularly wrong with that approach. We've got lots of research involving that approach, what we call medication algorithms. And those medication algorithms might start with either a single medication or one of 3 or 4 medications. And then depending on what happens, you move to the next step in the algorithm. Or even the algorithm might start with a very large number of valid first-line therapy choices. And then altered depending on the outcome of that trial. I tend to start a little bit differently. I work a lot with, I try to find out as much as I can about the family and any family history of similar disorders. And whenever possible, finding out what medications, if any, worked for them, because these people share a large amount of genetics with their first degree relatives. And so when somebody tells me, well, yeah, it turns out we didn't know 10 years ago, but now we know that my mother, my brother, and my sister all have major depressive disorder. They've all tried a whole variety of medications, and all 3 of them landed on paroxetine and are doing great. Well, most of my work is done. I know where I'm going to start now because of the genetic similarities.
Yeah. Well, what you're illustrating there is what we were talking about before we went live, which is how psychiatry has changed over the last probably 100 years, when it was a new science back then, and a soft science too, because it's dealing with very complex organisms, which means that there's so many interfering factors. It's difficult to get an empirical outcome that can be pinned as the cause of whatever effect you're examining. But since then, since the early days of who was it, Freud and Jung, when they were merely guessing or expressing opinions, it seems to me as a layman. And since then, we've moved enormously forward, and as you mentioned, we now have DNA, and we can spot genes that are not necessarily causal, but maybe correlated, and family heredity, and so on. So what I wanted to touch on is how do we assess this progress? Because the university department still has psychiatry above the door. And although knocking on that door is a new science called neuroscience, which may be going to merge or take over. What do you think, Scott?
Well, there are still lots of places where those are separate. I know a few where they're joined, but psychiatry is a clinical science. It's an applied science. Neuroscience is much more of what you would think of as a laboratory or bench science. And psychiatry then utilizes everything we can get our hands on from neuroscience in order to inform our decisions going forward. There is plenty of actual science that goes on in psychiatry, direct science, but neuroscience is much more about things that are worth knowing about how the brain operates, even
Mm-hmm.
if those cannot be utilized in clinical practice for a living, breathing brain
Mm.
for another 20 or 30 years.
Mm.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I see where you're coming from. It's neuroscience is all about high-tech equipment, isn't it? Which,
Yeah. I mean, there is a lot of that, but underneath the high-tech equipment, there have to be the scientists behind it knowing how to ask good questions
yeah,
and formulate a research project that directly answers those questions.
yeah. But in the treatment side of things, it's assessing the the effectiveness is in psychiatry is quite difficult. I mean, you've got a subject who's got a temperature and you give him some temperature reducing medicine, you can check whether it's worked or not. But psychiatry isn't quite as empirical as that, is it? You've How do you get your feedback? It's got to be verbal from the patient, hasn't it?
Well, it does, but there are lots of instruments, lots of questionnaires that are extraordinarily well validated, and their reliability is very, very high. And we've got, tons and tons of studies showing that this particular questionnaire or this one really does correlate so precisely with actual disease that we
Mm,
can use it either for diagnostic purposes or for monitoring purposes, depending
mm,
on which one we're doing at the moment.
mm,
Very few scales are, not very few, some scales are useful for both diagnosis and monitoring, but there are many others that are not validated for both diagnosis and monitoring. They're
right.
designed for a different purpose, and so they're used differently.
Yeah. But the odd
I
thing
want
is, sorry, Tercia, shall I just finish this and then put you in?
to finish your thought. Yep, finish your thought. I've made a note.
Okay, right. The odd thing is that some of the treatments can be assessed as being effective. We don't know how. We don't know why. We haven't got a hypothesis for understanding the actual mechanism, what's going
Well,
on in the brain.
we have a hypothesis. We have lots of things we do know about how they work, but you're
Mm,
right. In many cases, we don't know all of the details about the internal cellular chemistry regarding
mm,
exactly how they work.
mm.
We
Yeah,
certainly do know a fair amount about which receptors they block and to what degree and how
yeah,
strongly they attach to the receptor, all kinds of fascinating things. But
yeah.
what you're talking about is also true of much of the rest of medicine.
Mm. And that's true.
For
Yes.
many, many chronic diseases, we don't know exactly why this went wrong. We don't know to a complete detailed degree how the treatments work. And certainly when you talk about the psychotherapies, the talk therapies, we
Mm,
have very little information on how they work. We have
yeah,
lots of information on which ones do work, under what
yeah.
circumstances, but we have almost no information on how they work.
Right. Yes. So the psychiatrist's couch is a mystery still. The counselling service is still a mystery. Interesting. But I was thinking of.
I think,
Sorry, Persia, you have a go.
thank
Go
you,
on.
John. I, but I think that it's not a case as much as of that psychiatry or the psychiatrist's couch or psychologist's couch is a mystery. I think it's the human brain that is as much a mystery as the deep oceans. Scott, I want to ask you, do you ever work only with medication? Is there always a combination between psychology and other types of talk therapy and medication? Do you ever have a psychiatric condition where you just say, all right, take this pill and come back and see me in 6 weeks? or is it always a case that it's hand in hand talk therapy? Because that's my experience with relatives and people, friends who have psychiatric problems or psychological problems. How strict is the line dividing psychiatric problems and psychological problems? Could you give us some?
So, psychiatric problems versus psychological problems is the practical definition is sort of reverse. If you're seeing a psychiatrist, it's a psychiatric problem. If you're not seeing a psychiatrist, you're seeing a psychologist, it's a psychological problem.
Wow.
Now, I know it's sort of ludicrous to even say, but in the real world, that's essentially what happens. As to whether there are ever patients where we're utilizing only medication, unfortunately, at least in this country, there is a tremendous shortage of psychiatrists and a tremendous shortage of psychologists, especially in the public health realm. And so it is, there are more people that we can get to in the public realm by utilizing primarily medications. And for the kinds of patients that I work with, they're not going to be able to do much in the way of therapy until I can get their severe hallucinations and delusions under control. Now, I don't mean that to say that people with hallucinations and delusions cannot benefit from psychological interventions. Just yesterday, I was talking via email with one of my old colleagues who is a therapist, and we worked together on a case that involved a gentleman with very severe schizophrenia. And the supervisor insisted that the therapist pursue therapy, even though this gentleman was so impaired by hallucinations and delusions. And the therapist went ahead and pushed forward, and sure enough, this man identified for himself he had an enormous epiphany when he was looking at a drawn out family tree and the problems that were identified in different members of the family. And he looked at this, and in the midst of all of his internal voices and visions, he looked at this and he said, there it is. That's where this started. And to him, this meant it's not just me. It's not that I'm broken. It's not that I'm bad. It's that at least a good portion of this got passed down to me. Now, my job is to deal with it, but it dramatically changed his impression of himself, and it dramatically changed his outlook going forward.
Wow.
Sorry, bit of an aside, but sometimes people really
That is very interesting.
In practice, many people will say and behave as if people with severe psychotic disorders cannot benefit from therapy. And not only do we know from research that that's wrong, but this particular case was an extraordinarily powerful example for both the therapist and for me.
Interesting, because
Scott, to what extent can, I'm sorry, John.
There's a time lag.
Yeah, it's the time lag. Can I go first?
Go.
I want to ask, to what extent can neuroimaging, and I'm particularly referring to neuroimaging, help at this moment in time? Because I know that thing is a perfect science by any means. So if you have a patient that is really heavily psychotic, can that actually be seen in neuroimaging, or are we not there yet?
We're not there yet. I wish we
Okay.
had the resources to do a simple scan, CT scan or MRI, on every patient with psychotic disorders at least once in their life, so that we can rule out the very, very rare chance that this is being caused by some sort of anatomically identifiable problem. But these are functional problems, much more than they are anatomic. So if you think of it in terms of other
Well, as far as we know at
organs,
this stage, Scott,
right?
would it be
Right.
would it be fair to say, as far as we face at this moment in time, because although neuroimaging has changed and developed in leaps and bounds in the past just 10 years, it reminds me when I look at the history of science, and John, we spoke about this earlier, that we actually want to talk a little bit about science. But the interesting thing about science is that as the science takes a step forward and then the technology takes a step, technology leads into something new in the science. And it's this continuous process. If you just think of the development of the microscope or the telescope. So before there was a telescope, Galileo and Tycho Brahe and those guys wouldn't have been able to see what they saw. And because of the technology, they came to different conclusions. And I'm hoping in terms of psychiatric and psychological disorders, that the imaging technology will develop to we actually, maybe there is something anatomical, chemical or anatomical. I mean, it could be either or both, I suppose. Where we can actually use it to make a diagnosis.
There will certainly be some. And like many fields, not only is the hardware advancing at very rapid speeds, the software to analyze the data coming from the hardware is probably accelerating even more than the hardware itself. And so our ability to analyze the data in new ways, collect the data in new ways, is probably going to be at least as important, I think probably more important, than the actual hardware increases. Because when you're talking about hardware and the brain, there's simply no good way, we need to get into the brain to see these tiny little differences. And well, some of my patients periodically ask me, how come we don't have a cure for this the way we have for, this disease or that disease? How come we don't have, all of these monoclonal antibody treatments that we now have for all of these other diseases? And if my patients are capable of doing this, I look them dead in the eye and say, well, it's because of the selfishness of my patients. Very few of them will let me crack open their brain and take their brain out and slice it up into little tiny pieces so that I can try.
Yeah, it's very mean.
Well,
those that can handle my degree of sarcasm never ask that question again.
What you've touched on there is well, there's so many things we could bounce off in a number of directions, because I've interviewed some neuroscientists, one of whom uses light, because believe it or not, the skull is actually transparent to very powerful light.
Right.
And she has an amazing skull cap that is so safe to use, you can use it on babies and study what's happening in their brains. So you're right, there's huge leaps forward being made pretty much as we sit here and talk. But what you said earlier made me think about the heredity aspect of this. You talked about a patient who spotted ancestors that had the same condition. And the thing about that is, while it can help you identify the probability that you might suffer from dementia later in life, for example, it sort of robs us of our responsibility, because we can say, it's not my fault. My grandfather gave me this.
Well, I mean, that's true of everything. You know,
Say that.
my
Yeah.
my grandfather gave me, grandfathers on both sides gave me a propensity toward belly fat. Um, but that doesn't alleviate my responsibility to do something about it if I don't want to have the same outcomes.
Yeah. The difference is, of
Can I
course,
make
that belly fat
Can I say
is
something?
okay.
I need to. Sorry, but I think we need to maybe clarify. Well, I would like to clarify that I don't believe that we have free will. So that's a topic for another day. But
Mm.
because I'm not convinced that we have free will. So I don't think that we choose any action as much as we think we choose it. We are driven by a myriad of factors, of which the most are subdivisions of culture, parentage, DNA, and then brain chemistry of the individual. I think maybe we can clarify the discussion by distinguishing between responsibility and consequences. So I don't think that I think that's a useful distinction. I'm not responsible for my inclination to get fat, but if I don't take the necessary steps to prevent it, then I will have to live with the consequences. And I think that prevents a person from saying, well, I can't do anything about it because it's not, I didn't ask for it. But to emphasize the fact that, yes, you didn't ask for it, you have to find ways of dealing with the consequences in a constructive way, because you have to live with the consequences regardless of what the origin of the problem is.
You're absolutely right, and the hereditary issue doesn't, like I say, doesn't alleviate you from responsibility in regards to where this is going to lead, what the outcomes are going to be. What it can do is dramatically change your understanding of your place in this process. It's not because I'm a bad person. It's because there is something different about my physiology versus, well, I have a brother who stays bone thin no matter what he eats all his life, and he's always been that way. And I used to be that way in my youth, as my what was very clear to me were genes from one side of the family started to kick in around 30. Not only did I start gaining weight, but I started looking much more like that side of the family than the other side. And, you know, it was 24 years before I decided to actually do something about that. And I had to put in a lot of work, but the sense that some part of this was hereditary kept me from identifying myself as the problem.
Yeah. Well,
whether or not you call it heredity, I was the problem was a matter of metabolism and calories in and calories out, and there were only a few of those things that I had control over. If I wanted to change the outcome, I absolutely had to change those factors that were under my control.
Yeah. Well, the difference here is overweight is a physical condition. You could recognize it in terms of actual measurements of shape and heaviness, whereas behaviors are much more intangible. And people find it's difficult to acknowledge that we can inherit behaviors. And that's why it's the common perception is that you should be able to sort of snap out of it, because it lacks this sort of reality that a lump of fat has. You see where I'm going?
Yes, you're absolutely right.
John,
And
sorry, I want to ask you, Scott, and this might be important. What you just said relates to the fields of psychiatry and psychology in very tangible ways, because when you have a physical ailment, nobody will go around with an obviously broken arm or leg or whatever. Or if you see a mole on your skin and you can see this thing is looking different, you go to the doctor, and nobody thinks it's funny. Nobody, in fact, people will say to you, you have to see somebody about this as soon as possible. But when it comes to if I can use the term diseases of behavior, which is not, I know it's not a scientific term at all, but we don't have that same attitude. Neither the individual who's suffering nor the people around them. People tend to say, just pull yourself together,
Right. But we
it's
actually
getting much better.
We actually do have the same problem with obesity. There are lots and lots of people who say and behave in ways that suggest that this is completely a self-made problem, and you just have to put down the tub of ice cream, and that's all you have to do. And people say this to themselves, and it prevents them, in many cases, from being able to move forward. Because they've decided I should be able to do this in a completely voluntary manner. It must all be completely my fault. And if I haven't already solved it since I thought about it yesterday, that means I am a failure. And so much of that is true.
That's right.
For obesity. Fat shaming is one of the biases that we still have not conquered very much at all. However, your larger point about behavior is absolutely true. People equate behavior and thoughts with self. The victim of the disorder has those thoughts that it's about self, and it means that I'm wrong, I'm broken, I'm bad. Or and lots of people on the outside say, look, I understand he has anxiety, but why does he have to do this to me? Well,
yeah.
You understand he has anxiety, but you don't understand why he has to be anxious around you. It's like saying, well, I understand he's in a wheelchair, but when he's around me, I want him to walk. No, that doesn't make any sense.
Not going to work.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the thing is that there are some, what you might call behavioral conditions, which are obviously beyond the individual's control. I'm thinking of Tourette's, for example. And in those cases, the general public are willing to admit that this might be a disorder and not just a disobedience or something like that.
But only as long as they don't have to be around that patient for very long. If they're around that patient for very long, they start to become irritated by the behaviors, and they start to interpret the behaviors as intentional and voluntary.
Ooh.
Yeah.
That's a problem for Tourette sufferers, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, you're both teachers, right?
Mm.
Have you ever seen a teacher understand that a student has ADHD, but that teacher has decided to go on a tirade and declare that, yes, he has that, but all of these behaviors that annoy me personally are all voluntary and intentional. He's using his claim of ADHD just to get under my skin. Has either of you ever seen that?
Yes. Well, I'm ashamed of
Well,
some
something.
of, I'm ashamed of some of the behaviour of some of my former colleagues many years ago, before we became wised up to the nature of these conditions. Um,
Well,
and
I, I, I'm one step better than that. I'm ashamed of my own behavior. If I think back to my behavior when I started teaching 22, 20, 24 years ago, when I was a junior teacher, when I began teaching, I I didn't know there wasn't such a thing as ADHD. When I
no, no,
started teaching
exactly.
in when I started teaching in 1997, 1996, ADHD wasn't a thing. Kids were naughty or they were good, and
Exactly.
you
Yeah,
treated them accordingly. And
yeah. I
if I
want to
think
build
back,
I want to build out on that, because over my teaching
yeah,
career, which is long ago, much before yours, Tercia, a lot of labels have appeared for conditions
never,
that
I would have never said
we
that.
didn't know existed. There was just people, pupils, a class. Some of them were a bit odd in some directions, some of them were a bit odd in other directions, but now they've all got labels. And of course, this is only to be expected as we discover more about how we as humans work.
Right. Right. And those labels, like any labels, those labels can be misused.
Mm-hmm.
But what they provide is a structure, a pattern of predictability for the others around.
Mm.
So if you know that this student has severe ADHD,
Mm.
you can expect certain problems. You also can expect that certain kinds of changes in how the teacher operates can benefit that student and can even benefit how the class interacts with that
Yeah.
student. If
Mm.
you have a label of autism spectrum disorder,
Mm.
there is a scaffold then of understanding and predictions about what kinds of problems will occur and what kinds of interventions are most likely to help,
Yeah.
as opposed to just leaving it up to each teacher to make a guess and be sure about their own guesses as to the cause of these behaviors and what kinds of interventions should be utilized, which unfortunately, without the real information, led to some of the teachers being what we now recognize as abusive, not necessarily
Mm.
hitting, but abusive in other ways,
Mm.
because they thought that this pupil simply needs to understand who's in charge.
Yeah. Well, it was very much in my early teaching days a case of being in charge, and by means of the cane, if necessary. And so there were no problems for teachers. There was just naughty people, cane them; thick people, let them get on with it. And life was very much more simple for a teacher. But now a teacher has to be a psychiatrist, a counselor, a parent, and it all became very much more difficult. So I wanted to
John,
lead on.
oh, John, thank you. When I advertised our show on Twitter, I said it's going to be an unraveling, and so far we haven't unraveled at all. So, would it be permissible for me to just ask one word and hear Scott's opinion about that, and that's psychedelics and psychiatric treatment? MDMA, what's your opinion, Scott?
Well, I have to say, when I first started hearing rumblings about using psychedelics, hallucinogens, etc., in mental health practice, I was very skeptical. I really thought that this was all just going to be justification for um, a Timothy Leary school of mental health treatments. And as the research has gone on, I have had to change my mind. There are things happening that I did not predict at all. And ketamine is now a well-researched and useful psychiatric treatment. There's just no question about it. Is it the best thing since sliced bread? Probably not. But then again, sliced bread wasn't that great.
Especially not the white sort.
And we're back to the prejudices. But
Well, at least it's not pretty.
So, in my own, in the agency that I work with, we are about to open 2 ketamine clinics for people with severe depression. There are lots of providers in the private world already doing it. The generic name for the medication is esketamine, and this is researched and FDA approved. This is not an off-label treatment. This is not, far out medicine and practitioners just choosing to do something because they believe in it without the science behind it. This is a real treatment. The psychedelics, I think we're going to see those in at least some forms become a very serious, useful, FDA approved set of treatments.
Yeah.
I've completely changed my mind on this topic.
And of course you have
scientist. You're a real scientist, Scott. Despite being a psychiatrist, you are a real scientist.
Oh, I love that. Despite being a psychiatrist. Okay, all right.
Whoa. Insult the guest, why don't
because
you?
you're going with you've changed your mind. And look, I regard psychiatrists as real scientists.
Relate.
Joking, but I love that phrase, that the idea and the principle that you've changed your mind because you're going with it, you follow the evidence. And if the evidence requires that you have to change your mind, then you have to change your mind, because to do otherwise would be foolish.
Absolutely. So you've got several states now that have legalized medical cannabis, I believe, in the US. I know it's not widely regarded maybe as a psychotic, or is it? But it's certainly becoming more accepted. What do you think?
It really has not entered much into the legitimate medical world of psychiatry. Certainly, cannabis is useful for a few very specific things. Nausea during chemotherapy for cancer. There's no question this is extraordinarily useful, not only for nausea, but to increase appetite. If the patient is wasting away, their body simply is not going to have the strength to fight off both the cancer and the chemotherapy. We need their body to fight both at the same time. And there are a few other things, certain types of glaucoma. Yes, absolutely, it's helpful. There's no question about that. But as a treatment for psychiatric disorders or psychological disorders or mental health, however we want to phrase it, there really just is not much evidence yet. I think we might eventually find some. I think and I don't mean that to sound dismissive, we might eventually find some. No, I think we probably will find some specific indications and particular dosage guidelines to fit that. and dosage forms that make sense.
Mm-hmm.
When you're talking about smoking a medicine, the medicine enters your bloodstream and your brain very, very rapidly. And it takes only a very small amount of dose in terms of your total blood concentration to have effects, which also means that if it has any positive effects, those are likely to go away very quickly. One of the problems we've had with the very short-acting benzodiazepines like Xanax, alprazolam, is that it works so rapidly that the effect is also gone very rapidly. A patient goes from having high anxiety to having no anxiety in a matter of minutes, and in a matter of couple of hours, their body rebounds against that medication. They have even higher anxiety, so now they need 2 pills.
Yes. We don't use them in the UK anymore either. We had a heyday of using them back in the 1960s. Our versions were called Librium or Valium. And even the Rolling Stones wrote a song about Mother's Little Helper.
That's right.
Because, and I remember one of my aunties was actually addicted to Valium. She had to take it daily for the rest of her life because the consequences of withdrawal were too harsh. But that's all history now. We don't use any of those drugs, it seems, hardly at all.
Oh, yeah, they're still out there.
Are they?
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. And they have some very, very good indications, but they have to be prescribed and monitored very carefully to keep them in the useful realm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Tercia, come back with your lag.
Sorry about that. You don't have to answer. I suppose it's the type of question that just by asking it, you're giving an answer. I wanted to ask whether either of you two gentlemen have ever taken any hallucinogenic drugs, and I'm a real nerd. I haven't even smoked a cigarette in my entire life, though I've been tempted lately to try cannabis because I've heard it helps one sleep, and I don't sleep well, so. Have either of you had any experience in the past with these types of medication?
No, my drug of choice is alcohol. I don't take much of that either. My son, as one of my sons, his drug of choice is cannabis. So it takes all sorts, and everyone has their preference.
I'm going to plead the Fifth Amendment.
Yes. Very useful amendment, that one. Yes. Well, it's got career implications.
It's funny. But it fascinates me, and I know people who use mushroom. What is the scientific name?
Psilocybin.
And that's right, psilocybin, and they swear by microdosing with psilocybin. That I know people who've suffered from depression for many, many years, and since they've begun microdosing with psilocybin, it's the only thing that's ever only chemical substance that's ever given them relief. So yeah, I think there needs to be a change in terms of also how society views these drugs. There's a very interesting documentary on Netflix, Change My Mind, that explores the history of these drugs. I don't know if any of our viewers, if you want to watch something really interesting, and also the impact and the influence of society and culture on how we view these medications. Very, very insightful. So yeah, I mean, as I say, I've never taken any substance like that, but I've been tempted to try cannabis. I just don't smoke, so I don't know how I'll have to get chewables or edibles from somewhere.
Yeah, you can eat it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cannabis cake.
So
I'd like that.
the series you're
But I'm too
talking about,
scared. What if it doesn't? What if it? Go on, Scott.
the series you're talking about, Change My Mind. I believe that's the one from the journalist Michael Pollan. Is that right?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
He's. I think he's a good journalist. I think he's a better writer. And but what I have found is that it seems to me like he interviews several people, and he likes to interview people who are on the fringes of any topic, the people holding controversial ideas in a field. And he interviews them to try and find out, well, what is the controversy? In which cases are people on the fringe just being on the fringe because they like being on the fringe? In what cases do they hold ideas that might actually be useful and should become the consensus? But I think he becomes enamored with those on the fringe. And then he goes about developing the rest of his book, and in this case, a mini-series, docu-series, that presumes that ideas on the fringe are by default the correct ideas.
Yes, yes. I there's a very common tendency to think that the weird, unsubstantiated ideas, because the consensus hasn't come to an absolute truth yet, then it must be this weird, beyond the fringe idea. And of course, that's a fallacy.
Well, and the other side of that is you don't sell books or movies talking about what is already the consensus.
Yes, yes, indeed. Yes, there is a motive there. Do you know, we're coming up to
exactly why in the last 2 minutes that we have,
yes.
Sorry about
Poor Tercy is out of sync. No, it's not your fault. You're out of sync with us for some reason. I don't know why this is.
Maybe it's because I'm a woman, and maybe it's because I'm sitting in Africa. But I was going to say that's what you said now about that miniseries. It's one of the reasons that I won't just tell anybody and everybody I go and watch that series, because I think one needs a little bit of discernment. So I have a lot of faith in the viewers of the FreeThought Hour will apply their minds as needed. So I wouldn't tell all my college students, go and watch that because you need. I think with Scott, I feel safe with you. You will guide me to. So next time I'm going to ask you, should I take cannabis or not?
He doesn't do long distance remote diagnosis, I'm afraid, or a prescription.
No, it's not a diagnosis. He just has to say yes or no. I'll make my own mind up. It's just nice to get a professional opinion.
So the answer is, if you're having a problem sleeping, you ought to talk to somebody who can help you figure out why before you start trying to apply a treatment.
Sleep is another whole show, all of its own, as is truth. And of course, the week after next, Scott, you will be appearing with us again in the company of David Orenstein, our friendly anthropologist, and we will talk about some of those human ideas. That's not the right word. Human concepts.
Evolution.
I particularly want to deal with truth because Neil deGrasse Tyson has made a little 5-minute video on his idea about truth, and I'd like you guys to respond to that. So next week we have a problem because I think it's going to be Rosa Rubicondior, who is a great evolution protagonist. But I think, Tercia, you think it's going to be Charles Webster.
We'll have that fight in private, John, but I think you're the boss. So
Well,
let's not air our dirty laundry.
In this case, we've got to sort out those two guests, because if they both think they're coming on the same day, we've got to ask one of them to delay.
Well, as I said, let's not air our dirty laundry and my poor communication skills. I will apologize for my over-eagerness, whoever I need to apologize.
It's your connection tonight. I think you've got a problem with your connection. Anyway, guys, thank you very much. It's been a thoroughly edifying experience. And thank you for watching, people who will see this show. And we'll be doing it again next week with whoever it is. Say bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.